My grandmother died on a Tuesday in late October, passing quietly in her sleep in the same farmhouse where she had been born 87 years before. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful, that she hadn't suffered, that she had simply slipped away sometime between the nurse's midnight check and the gray dawn that followed. I received the call at 6 in the morning, standing in my kitchen in Charlotte with a coffee cup I would never drink, listening to my mother's voice crack over words she had been preparing to say for months but still couldn't quite manage. The funeral was 3 days later, in Asheville, in a church my grandmother had attended every Sunday of her adult life. The service was small but genuine, filled with people who had known her in ways I never had, who shared stories about a woman I recognized only in fragments. My mother spoke. My uncle read a poem. I sat in the front pew with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the particular numbness that comes from grief you haven't yet learned how to feel. I stayed an extra day to help with the house, sorting through belongings that held meaning only to her, deciding what to keep and what to donate and what to throw away. My mother and uncle handled most of it, their familiarity with the space making them more efficient than I could hope to be. By the time I left, late in the afternoon on a Saturday that felt more like November than October, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. I chose the Blue Ridge Parkway for the drive home because my grandmother had loved it. She used to take me on drives when I was young, winding through the mountains in her old Buick, pointing out overlooks and wildflowers, and the particular way the light hit the ridgelines at sunset. The parkway was her church as much as any building, and driving it felt like a way to say goodbye that the funeral hadn't quite managed. The sun was already low when I entered the parkway at Asheville, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber that would have made her smile. I drove slowly, savoring the curves, stopping at overlooks I remembered from childhood, and some I didn't recognize at all. The leaves were past their peak but still beautiful, clinging to branches with the desperate persistence of things that know their time is ending. By the time full dark had settled over the mountains, I was somewhere around mile marker 380, alone on a road that felt emptier than it should have been for a Saturday night. The tourist season was winding down, I told myself. People had better things to do than drive a scenic highway they couldn't see. But the explanation didn't quite satisfy, and I found myself checking my mirrors more often than the empty road behind me warranted. The headlights appeared around mile marker 382. I noticed them the way you notice any car on a lonely road, with the particular awareness that comes from being alone in the dark. They emerged from a pullout I had passed seconds before, their high beams cutting through the darkness with an intensity that seemed almost aggressive. I assumed they would pass. The parkway had plenty of opportunities for faster drivers to get around slower ones, and I was in no hurry, still processing the week's grief, still saying my private goodbyes to mountains my grandmother had loved. But they didn't pass. They settled into a position about 100 feet behind me and stayed there, matching my speed with a precision that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Not close enough to be tailgating, not far enough to be following at a comfortable distance. Just present, fixed in my rearview mirror, their high beams bright enough to make me squint whenever I glanced back. I slowed down, dropping from 45 to 35, hoping they would take the hint and go around. The headlights slowed with me, maintaining that exact distance, that exact position, as if connected to my car by an invisible tether. I sped up. They matched me again, their response so immediate it felt less like driving and more like being tracked. The first real fear came around mile marker 375. I had tried everything I could think of to shake them, varying my speed erratically, taking curves faster than I should have, braking suddenly at straightaways. Nothing worked. The headlights stayed locked in position, responding to my movements with a precision that no human driver should have been capable of. They weren't just following me. They were mirroring me, anticipating me, predicting my behavior before I knew what I was going to do. I pulled into an overlook around mile marker 370, a small gravel lot that overlooked a valley so dark it might as well have been a void. My plan was simple: let them pass, see what kind of car it was, maybe get a glimpse of the driver, something that would transform this from a faceless threat into an ordinary vehicle with an ordinary explanation. I pulled in and put my car in park, leaving the engine running, my doors locked, my hands gripping the wheel even though I wasn't moving. The headlights pulled in behind me. They stopped about 20 feet away, their high beams flooding my mirrors, washing out any chance I had of seeing what was behind them. I waited, expecting them to pass, expecting a door to open, expecting something to happen that would break the terrible stalemate we had entered. The lights went out. The darkness that followed was absolute. No moon, no stars, no ambient glow from distant cities to soften the black that pressed against my windows like something physical. I sat there in my idling car, staring at mirrors that showed me nothing, listening to silence that seemed to have weight and texture, waiting for something I couldn't name and couldn't prepare for. I don't know how long I waited. 20 minutes maybe. 20 minutes of darkness and silence, and the particular terror of not knowing what was out there, what had been following me, what was sitting 20 feet away in a vehicle I couldn't see. My phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual for this part of the parkway, but which felt like another strand in a web that was slowly tightening around me. I should have stayed. Should have waited until dawn, until other cars appeared, until the darkness lifted and revealed whatever mundane reality was hiding behind those headlights. But the silence was worse than the following had been. The stillness was worse than the pursuit. The not knowing was a weight I couldn't carry for another minute, let alone another hour. I put my car in drive and pulled back onto the parkway. The headlights came back on the moment I moved. I don't know how to describe the sound I made when I saw them in my mirror again, resuming their position as if nothing had happened, as if the 20 minutes of darkness had been a pause rather than an ending. It wasn't a scream. It was something lower, something that came from a part of me that recognized danger in ways my conscious mind couldn't process. A sound my grandmother might have recognized, rooted in the same mountains where she had lived her entire life. I drove faster after that, took the curves at speeds that should have sent me over the guardrails, pushed my car through the darkness with a recklessness that felt like prayer. The headlights stayed with me, matching every acceleration, every turn, every desperate attempt to outrun whatever was hunting me through these mountains. The tunnel appeared around mile marker 335. I knew this stretch of the parkway, had driven it with my grandmother a dozen times, had memorized its curves and overlooks, and the places where the road bent in ways that surprised you, even when you were expecting them. There was no tunnel here. The parkway ran through open air for miles in both directions, carving along ridgelines rather than through them. But there it was, a mouth of darkness ahead of me, swallowing the road, stretching into the mountainside with an inevitability that made my stomach clench. I should have stopped, should have recognized that something was wrong, that the world had shifted in ways that couldn't be explained by grief or exhaustion or the tricks that darkness plays on tired eyes. Instead, I drove in. The tunnel was cold, not just dark, but cold in a way that seeped through my closed windows and settled into my bones. My headlights seemed to dim the moment I entered, their beams absorbed by walls that glistened with moisture I could almost smell. The road curved ahead of me, descending when it should have been level, turning in directions that made no sense for a parkway tunnel. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw nothing. The entrance had vanished behind me, replaced by the same darkness that stretched ahead. The headlights that had followed me for 47 miles were gone. I was alone in a tunnel that shouldn't exist, in a darkness that felt like it had been waiting for me, in a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off walls I couldn't see. The exit appeared without warning, a circle of moonlight ahead of me, silver and cold, growing larger as I drove toward it with a speed that felt less like choice and more like expulsion. I emerged onto a stretch of parkway I didn't recognize, pulled over at the first overlook I found, and sat there until dawn, with my doors locked and my hands shaking, and my mind refusing to process what had just happened. The ranger station opened at 8. I drove there as soon as the sky was light enough to see, pulled into the parking lot with an urgency that must have shown on my face, and walked inside to find a man in a uniform who looked like he had been expecting me. I told him about the headlights, about the pullout and the following, and the tunnel that had appeared where no tunnel should be. I told him everything, speaking in a rush that probably made me sound crazy, watching his face for the skepticism I was certain would appear. It didn't appear. Instead, something else crossed his features, something that looked almost like recognition, like resignation, like the particular weariness of someone who has heard this story before. He told me there was no tunnel between those mile markers, said there never had been, said the parkway had been built along ridgelines specifically to avoid the expense of tunneling through mountains that were mostly solid granite. I asked him about the headlights, about the car that had followed me, that had pulled into the overlook behind me, that had sat in darkness for 20 minutes before resuming its pursuit. He didn't answer, just looked at his computer screen, typed something I couldn't see, and printed out a report for me to sign. His hands shook when he handed back my driver's license. Just slightly, just for a moment, but enough to notice. And he wouldn't meet my eyes. Kept his gaze fixed on his computer, on his paperwork, on anything except the face of the woman who had just described something that shouldn't have been possible. I drove the rest of the way home on the interstate. 4 hours of fluorescent highway lights and other cars, and the ordinary rhythm of traffic that felt like safety, even though I knew, somewhere deep in my chest, that safety had nothing to do with roads or lights or the presence of other people. I've looked for that tunnel since. Driven the parkway twice in daylight, once with a friend who thought I needed to face my fears, searching for an entrance that I know I passed through. It isn't there. The road runs straight through open air, exactly as the ranger said, exactly as I remembered from every drive I had taken with my grandmother. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about headlights in my mirror, about a distance that never changes, a presence that never wavers, a pursuit that I escaped only because something decided to let me go. I dream about a tunnel that swallowed me whole and spat me out 40 miles from where I entered, in a darkness that felt less like absence of light and more like presence of something else entirely. My grandmother used to tell me stories about these mountains, about things that lived in the hollows and walked the ridgelines and watched travelers from places that couldn't be found on any map. I never believed her, thought they were just stories, the kind of tales old women told to children who wouldn't sit still. But she also told me that the mountains remembered, that they kept track of everyone who passed through, that they tested some and released others, that they were alive in ways that had nothing to do with trees or animals or any form of life we knew how to name. I believe her now. I believe her every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror, every time I pass a pullout in the darkness, every time I remember a tunnel that doesn't exist, and a ranger who wouldn't meet my eyes, and a stretch of parkway that I drove through alone, except for something that followed me for 47 miles and then simply stopped. I don't drive at night anymore. Don't take the parkway. Don't visit the mountains. Don't put myself in places where the darkness can find me. My grandmother would understand. She spent her whole life in these mountains, and she knew what lived in them better than anyone. She also knew when to stay inside. I should have listened to her sooner. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way, on empty roads in the middle of the night, with headlights in your mirror that follow too close and stop too perfectly, and vanish into tunnels that were never there at all. The conference in Boone had run 3 hours longer than scheduled, the kind of endless corporate meeting where everyone has something to say and no one has anything worth hearing. By the time I finally escaped the hotel ballroom and made it to my car, it was already past 9, and the drive home to Winston-Salem stretched ahead of me like a punishment for sins I couldn't remember committing. My wife had called twice during the final presentation, texts that said dinner was ready, and then that dinner was cold, and then nothing at all. The silence that married people learn to read better than words. I should have taken the interstate. That's what any sensible person would have done, especially at that hour, especially in October when the weather in the mountains could turn without warning. But the Blue Ridge Parkway was faster if you knew how to drive it, and I had been making this trip for years, threading through curves I could navigate in my sleep. The parkway would get me home by 11 instead of midnight, would give me a chance to salvage what remained of the evening, to apologize for the lateness, to be the husband I kept promising myself I would become. The first hour was uneventful. The road was empty, the way it usually was on weeknights, and I drove with the particular focus that comes from knowing exactly where you're going and how long it will take to get there. The mountains rose around me in shapes I could feel more than see, their presence a weight in the darkness, their peaks blocking out stars that should have been visible on a clear October night. The fog appeared around 11, somewhere between Grandfather Mountain and the Lynn Cove Viaduct. It didn't roll in gradually, the way fog usually does in these mountains. One moment the road ahead was clear, my headlights cutting clean lines through the darkness. The next, I was surrounded by white, so thick it seemed to have texture, pressing against my windows like something alive. My headlights became useless halos, illuminating nothing but the swirling mass that had swallowed me whole. I slowed to a crawl, then slower still, gripping my steering wheel with hands that had gone cold despite the heater running. Everyone knows what you're supposed to do when fog gets this bad. Pull over, wait it out, find a safe place to stop, and let the weather pass before continuing. But there were no pullouts that I could see, no overlooks or parking areas, just the narrow ribbon of road and the guardrails that marked the edge of drops I couldn't measure. I convinced myself that driving slow was the same as driving safe, that if I just kept moving, kept my speed down, kept my eyes on the white line that appeared and disappeared in my headlights, I would eventually emerge from the fog bank and find clear road ahead. The parkway didn't have fog like this for miles at a time. It would lift soon. It had to. That's when I saw her. She appeared at the edge of my high beams, just barely visible through the swirling white, a figure standing at the side of the road with a stillness that seemed wrong for someone caught outside in weather this bad. I had a split second to register details before my instincts took over. A woman, dark hair, a dress that seemed to glow faintly in my headlights, something pale and formal that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. He slammed me brakes. The car skidded slightly on the wet pavement, ABS pulsing beneath my foot, before coming to a stop maybe 30 feet past where she had been standing. My heart was pounding, the adrenaline surge of nearly hitting someone mixing with the confusion of what I had just seen. Who would be standing on the side of the parkway at 11 at night, in fog this thick, wearing a dress that looked like something from my grandmother's photo albums? I looked in my rearview mirror, expecting to see her behind me, maybe walking toward my car, maybe flagging me down for help. The mirror showed nothing but fog, white and impenetrable, swallowing everything beyond a few feet of red taillights. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Should I back up, get out and check on her, call 911 and report a pedestrian on the parkway? But my phone showed no signal, as it often didn't in this stretch of mountains, and the thought of getting out of my car, of stepping into that fog where I couldn't see more than arm's length in any direction, filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I drove forward instead, slowly, carefully, telling myself I would stop at the first pullout and try to figure out what I had seen. Maybe she was a hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe there was a breakdown I hadn't noticed. A car pulled off the road somewhere behind me. There were rational explanations. There were always rational explanations. I saw her again about a quarter mile ahead. Same position, same stillness, same pale dress glowing in my headlights, like it was generating its own light rather than reflecting mine. She was standing at the edge of the road, exactly as she had been before, facing my direction with a posture that suggested she had been waiting there for years rather than the 30 seconds since I had passed her. This time I didn't brake, just slowed to a near stop, my foot hovering between the gas and the brake, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. She couldn't have gotten ahead of me, not in fog this thick, not on a road with no shoulder, not moving faster than my car had been traveling. It was impossible, unless there were two of them. The thought was almost comforting. Two women, dressed identically, standing at intervals along the parkway, for reasons I couldn't understand, but which at least obeyed the basic laws of physics. Twins, maybe. Some kind of prank or performance art or whatever else people did on lonely roads in the middle of the night. I drove past her slowly, watching her in my peripheral vision, not wanting to look directly at her but unable to stop myself from looking anyway. She didn't move, didn't turn her head to follow my car, just stood there with her arms at her sides, her face a blur I couldn't focus on no matter how hard I tried. I was maybe 50 feet past her when I looked in my rearview mirror. The fog behind me was empty. She was gone. She appeared again around the next curve, closer to the center of the road this time, standing on the white line like she was daring me to hit her. Her dress was different now, not different in style, but different in condition, torn in places, stained with something dark that might have been mud or might have been something else entirely. Her hair, which had looked neat before, was tangled and wild, hanging in her face in strings that moved even though there was no wind. I stopped the car, sat there with my engine idling, staring at a figure who shouldn't have been there, who couldn't have been there, who was nonetheless standing directly in my path with a patience that felt less like waiting and more like hunting. "What do you want?" I said out loud, my voice strange and small in the silence of my car. I don't know if I expected an answer. I don't know what I expected at all. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the fog with her stained dress and her tangled hair in her face that I still couldn't see clearly no matter how hard I tried. I put my car in drive and inched forward, slowly, so slowly that I could have stopped in an instant if she moved, if she stepped aside, if she did anything other than stand there like a statue carved from fog and darkness. She vanished when I was about 10 feet away. One moment she was there, solid and present in my headlights. The next, she was simply gone, as if she had never existed, as if I had been staring at nothing but empty road and my own fear reflected back at me. I drove faster after that, probably faster than I should have in fog that thick, but I needed to be moving, needed to feel like I was making progress towards somewhere that wasn't here, somewhere that didn't have a woman in a ruined dress, appearing and disappearing on a road where no one should have been standing. She appeared twice more over the next half mile, each time closer to the center of the road, each time more damaged, her dress showing more tears, her skin showing more of whatever had stained it, her posture shifting from still to something that looked almost like anticipation. The last time I saw her, she was standing directly in my lane. Not at the edge, not on the white line. Directly in front of me, close enough that my headlights illuminated her completely, close enough that I could finally see her face. I wish I hadn't. Her mouth was open in a scream I couldn't hear, stretched wider than any mouth should stretch, frozen in an expression of terror or rage or something that had no name. Her eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, looking at me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure against my chest. Her hands were raised, reaching toward my windshield, fingers spread as if she was trying to grab something or push something away. I had maybe 2 seconds to react, 2 seconds to brake or swerve or do anything other than what I actually did. I closed my eyes and pressed the gas. The impact I expected never came. No thud against my bumper, no crack against my windshield, no resistance at all, just my car accelerating through space that should have contained a body, passing through the place where she had been standing, as if she had never been there at all. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, without looking in my mirrors, without doing anything except gripping my steering wheel and counting my breaths and praying to whatever might be listening, that the fog would lift and the road would stay clear, and I would make it home to my wife, who was angry about dinner, but who was also alive and real and waiting in a house that had walls and lights and locked doors. The fog lifted around Blowing Rock, the road ahead cleared, and I could see stars again, and the terror that had been squeezing my chest began to loosen just enough that I could think again, could process what had happened, could try to convince myself that it had been nothing more than exhaustion and fog and the tricks that darkness plays on tired eyes. I pulled into my driveway at 12:47 a.m., sat in my car for a long time, just breathing, just letting my heart rate return to something approaching normal. The house was dark except for the porch light my wife always left on, and I thought about going inside, about crawling into bed beside her, about pretending that this night had been nothing more than a long drive and bad weather and a conference that ran too late. That's when I noticed the handprint. It was on my passenger window, pressed into the condensation that had formed on the outside of the glass. A woman's hand, slender fingers spread wide, outlined in droplets of moisture that were already beginning to run. The print was on the outside of my car, placed there by someone who would have had to be reaching toward my window while I was driving, while I was moving at 40 miles an hour through fog that should have made such a thing impossible. I got out of my car and looked at the print more closely. It wasn't just moisture. There was something else there, something dark mixed in with the condensation, leaving traces that looked almost like the stains I had seen on her dress. I washed my car the next morning, scrubbed the window until no trace of the print remained, until I could almost convince myself that I had imagined it, that the whole night had been nothing more than stress and fog, and the particular isolation of driving alone through mountains that have been holding secrets since before humans had words to name them. But I haven't driven the parkway since. Haven't taken that route to Boone, haven't suggested it for weekend drives, haven't gone anywhere near the stretch between Grandfather Mountain and the Lynn Cove Viaduct, where the fog can roll in without warning, and the curves can hide things you don't want to see. My wife noticed the change, asked me about it once, why I always took the interstate now, why I added an hour to my commute rather than drive the road I used to love. I told her it was just easier, told her the parkway was too stressful at night, told her everything except the truth, which is that somewhere in those mountains, a woman in a ruined dress is still standing at the edge of the road, waiting for the next car to pass, waiting to appear and disappear and appear again until she finds what she's looking for. I don't know what that is. I don't know why she was there, what happened to her, what force keeps her appearing in the fog on a road where no one should be walking. I only know that she reached toward my car with hands that left marks on my window, that she screamed without sound, pleaded without words, tried to tell me something I couldn't understand and didn't want to learn. And I know that somewhere out there, in fog that rolls in without warning on roads that wind through mountains older than memory, she's still reaching, still screaming, still waiting for someone who will finally stop. The bet had been my idea, which is something I've never stopped regretting. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and my younger brother Danny had just graduated high school, and we were both home for what felt like the last time before our lives would diverge in ways we couldn't yet imagine. He was heading to basic training in August. I was going back to school in September. The weeks between felt precious in a way neither of us knew how to say out loud, so instead we did what brothers do. We competed. The Blue Ridge Parkway runs 469 miles from Virginia to North Carolina, winding through some of the most beautiful and isolated terrain on the East Coast. Neither of us had ever driven the whole thing. Most people don't, breaking it up into sections, stopping at overlooks and visitor centers, treating it like the scenic route it's designed to be, rather than a challenge to be conquered. But that summer, with time running out and a need to prove something we couldn't name, the parkway became a dare. The rules were simple. Start at one end, drive to the other, no stops except for gas and bathroom breaks. First one to suggest pulling over for any other reason loses. The loser had to pay for a steak dinner at the nicest restaurant we could find, which at our age meant anything that didn't have a drive-through window. We flipped a coin to see who would drive first. Danny won, which meant I was in the passenger seat when we entered the parkway at Rockfish Gap around 8 in the evening. The plan was to drive through the night, making it to Cherokee by morning, timing our arrival to the sunrise over the Smoky Mountains that our father had always talked about but never actually seen. The first few hours were uneventful. Danny drove with the careful attention of someone who had only had his license for 2 years, taking the curves slower than necessary, braking earlier than he needed to. I teased him about it at first, then fell silent as the darkness deepened and the mountains rose around us like walls. By 11, we had stopped for gas and traded places. I was behind the wheel now, driving through a stretch of parkway so dark that my headlights seemed to create the road rather than illuminate it. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches reaching over the pavement like fingers trying to touch. There were no other cars, no lights from houses or businesses, just the road and the forest and the two of us, brothers on a dare we had already started to regret. Midnight came and went without ceremony. Danny marked it on his phone, said something about being 1/3 of the way there, and went back to staring out his window at darkness that showed him nothing. I drove with my hands tight on the wheel, focusing on the next curve, the next straightaway, the next mile marker that told me I was making progress towards somewhere that wasn't here. The first crossing happened around 12:30. I was coming around a curve, my high beams cutting a narrow tunnel through the black, when something moved at the edge of my lights. It came from the left side of the road, emerging from the tree line with a speed that made my foot move toward the brake before my mind had finished processing what I was seeing. My first thought was deer. That's what you expect on the parkway at night, what every driver fears. Those moments when an animal appears without warning and you have a split second to react. But this wasn't a deer. The shape was wrong, the movement was wrong. Everything about it was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, but felt in my gut like a physical weight. It moved on 2 legs, fast and fluid, crossing the road in maybe 3 strides, disappearing into the tree line on the right before my headlights could fully catch it. I saw an impression of height, of limbs that seemed too long for the body they were attached to, of a gait that was almost human but not quite, not quite, not quite. I didn't brake, didn't slow down, just drove through the space where it had been, my heart pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel. "Did you see that?" Danny asked. His voice was strange, tight, carrying a fear I had never heard in him before. "Deer," I said, "just a deer." "That wasn't a deer." "It was a deer, Danny. What else would it be?" He didn't answer. We drove in silence for the next 10 miles, neither of us willing to acknowledge what we had both seen, both pretending that my explanation was sufficient, both hoping that the next stretch of road would be empty and normal, and free of things that crossed on 2 legs faster than any human could run. The second crossing happened around mile marker 280. Same movement, same speed, same direction, left to right, emerging from the forest as if it had been waiting for us, as if it had somehow gotten ahead of us despite our car traveling at 45 miles an hour through darkness that should have hidden everything. This time I saw more. The headlights caught it for maybe half a second longer, illuminating details I didn't want to see. Pale skin, limbs that bent at angles that suggested joints in places where joints shouldn't be. A head that turned toward us as it ran. A face that I couldn't make out but could feel looking at me, seeing me, knowing me in some way I couldn't understand. I pressed the gas harder. Danny was gripping the door handle with white knuckles, his breath coming fast and shallow. "That was the same one," he said. "That was the same fucking thing. Different animal. Has to be. It was running the same direction both times. How did it get in front of us?" I didn't have an answer. Didn't want to think about what an answer might mean. I just drove, pushing my car to speeds that were reckless on curves I couldn't see until I was already in them, trying to outrun something that seemed to be pacing us through the forest, appearing only when it wanted to be seen. The third crossing came 5 minutes later, then the fourth, then the fifth. By the sixth, Danny was crying, silent tears running down his face, his body pressed against the passenger door as if he could somehow put more distance between himself and whatever was out there. I wasn't crying, but only because I was driving, because I had to focus, because letting myself feel what I was actually feeling would have meant losing control of the car and ending up in the ravine that dropped away from the road into darkness I couldn't measure. The crossings weren't random. I understood that now, understood it with a certainty that made my stomach turn. Whatever was out there was following us, keeping pace with our car through forests that should have been impenetrable, appearing on the road at intervals that felt almost deliberate. It was showing itself to us, letting us know it was there, demonstrating capabilities that no animal I had ever heard of could possibly possess. By the 10th crossing, I had stopped counting. The creature, I couldn't call it an animal anymore, couldn't pretend it was anything that simple, appeared and disappeared with a regularity that felt like breathing, like heartbeats, like the rhythm of something that had been doing this for longer than either of us had been alive. I saw details I didn't want to see. The way its arms hung past its knees, the way its head sat on its neck at an angle that suggested bones arranged differently than human bones, the way it moved without sound, without effort, without any of the struggle that should come from running fast enough to keep pace with a car on a winding mountain road. We reached the visitor center around 2 in the morning. It was closed, of course, had been closed for hours. But the parking lot was there, and it was empty, and it was the first wide open space we had seen since the crossing started. I pulled in and killed the engine, and sat there with my brother in a darkness that felt almost safe compared to the tunnel of trees we had just escaped. "We should keep driving," Danny said, though his voice suggested he didn't believe it. I can't keep driving with that thing out there. It might not follow us here." It stayed in the trees. It was keeping up with us at 45 miles an hour. "You think a parking lot is going to stop it?" We didn't argue after that, just sat in my car with the doors locked and the windows up, staring at the tree line that surrounded the visitor center on 3 sides, watching for movement that we prayed wouldn't come. The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. Every shadow looked like something moving. Every sound, a branch creaking, leaves rustling and wind we couldn't feel became evidence that we weren't alone, that whatever had been crossing the road was still out there, still watching, still waiting for something we couldn't understand. But we never saw it again. The darkness slowly grayed, then lightened, then became the soft pink of mountain sunrise that our father had promised was worth any drive. By 6 o'clock, the world around us looked normal, beautiful, even. Just a visitor center in the mountains, surrounded by trees that held nothing more threatening than birds beginning their morning songs. I started the car. Danny didn't object. We drove the remaining miles in daylight, passing through scenery that should have taken our breath away, but which we barely noticed, both of us lost in thoughts we would never share with anyone who hadn't been there. We stopped for gas about 20 miles from Cherokee. I was filling the tank. Danny was inside buying coffee when I noticed the scratches. They were on the passenger side of the car, running from the front wheel well to the back door. Long parallel gouges, 4 of them, carved into the paint and the metal beneath, with a force that suggested something much stronger than fingernails or claws. The marks were too high to have been made by anything running alongside us at ground level. Whatever had left them had been reaching up, or reaching down, or moving in ways that didn't align with any animal behavior I'd ever learned about. Danny came out with the coffees and saw my face and followed my gaze to the scratches. He dropped both cups. The lids popped off and coffee splashed across the concrete, but neither of us moved to clean it up. The scratches formed a pattern, not random gouges, but deliberate marks, arranged in a way that looked almost like letters. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find words in the damage. I've never been able to read what they spelled. The marks are too rough, too primitive, carved by something that might not have understood our alphabet but was trying to communicate anyway. But I've also never been able to convince myself they were random. There's intention in those gouges, message in the damage. Something that was said to us, left on our car like a note, written in a language we don't have the ability to read. Danny went to basic training that August. He's a sergeant now, stationed overseas, calling home when he can and sending emails when he can't. We've never talked about what happened on the parkway. Never mentioned the crossings or the creature or the scratches that I had to explain to my insurance company as vandalism by persons unknown. But I know he remembers. I can see it in his eyes during our video calls, the same shadow I see in my own mirror. Something followed us that night. Something paced us through the forest for miles, crossing the road again and again, letting us know it was there, letting us know it could have caught us whenever it wanted. It chose not to. That's what I tell myself. It had every opportunity to stop our car, to force us off the road, to do whatever it was that creatures like that do to people who drive through their territory in the middle of the night. But it let us go. It just wanted us to know it existed, to carry that knowledge out of the mountains and into our ordinary lives. I still have the car, still have the scratches, which I've never repaired, which I cover with a magnetic sign that says nothing and hides everything. Sometimes, late at night, I go out to my garage and run my fingers over those gouges, feeling the message I can't read, wondering what it says, wondering what would have happened if we had stopped on that dark stretch of road instead of driving through. I don't drive the parkway anymore. Don't drive any mountain road after dark. Don't put myself in places where the trees press close and the curves hide what's waiting around the next bend. Danny doesn't either. According to the one conversation we almost had about it, the one that ended with both of us changing the subject before we could say anything that would make it real. Some things are better left unspoken. Some memories are better left unexamined. Some nights are better spent inside, with the doors locked and the lights on, and the certain knowledge that whatever crosses roads in the mountains is still out there, still running, still waiting for the next car to come around, the next curve. I hope it stays waiting. I hope I never see it again. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning, I think about those scratches on my car, about the pattern they form, about the message they might contain, and I wonder if it's still waiting because we're supposed to go back. The trip to Roanoke had been routine, the kind of sales call I made 3 or 4 times a month, driving from my apartment in Greensboro to meet clients who could have just as easily done everything over video chat, but who preferred the old-fashioned approach of handshakes and face-to-face conversations. I didn't mind. The drive was pleasant enough, especially in early autumn when the leaves were just starting to turn and the mountains that lined the route offered the kind of scenery that made 3 hours behind the wheel feel almost worthwhile. The meeting ran long, the way these things always do when clients want to talk more than they want to buy, and by the time I got back on the road it was already past 7. The sun was setting behind the ridgelines to my west, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that I would have appreciated more if I hadn't been tired and hungry and thinking about the leftover Chinese food waiting in my refrigerator at home. I took the Blue Ridge Parkway because it was faster than the interstate if you hit it at the right time, and because I knew these roads well enough to drive them without much thought. The parkway was quiet at this hour, empty except for the occasional car heading the opposite direction, their headlights flashing past and disappearing around curves that swallowed everything they touched. The radio had been scanning for stations since I left Roanoke. That's the thing about the mountains, they block signals like walls, creating dead zones that stretch for miles, turning even the most powerful transmitters into whispers that fade in and out without warning. I had cycled through the preset buttons without success, then switched to scan mode and let the radio search automatically, hoping it would find something worth listening to. It didn't. For nearly an hour, the radio cycled through static and fragments, a few seconds of country music that dissolved before I could identify the song, a preacher's voice cut off mid-sentence. What might have been news, or might have been an emergency broadcast, or might have been nothing at all. I gave up eventually, resigned to silence, focused on the road ahead and the curves that required my attention. That's when the radio locked onto something clear. The voice came through without static, without interference, with a clarity that seemed impossible, given how badly every other station had been blocked. It was a man's voice, deep and calm, speaking in a rhythm that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. A prayer maybe, a liturgy, the kind of measured cadence that belongs to rituals older than the people performing them. He was reading names. I didn't notice at first. The voice blended into the background noise of driving, becoming just another sound in a car full of sounds, the hum of the engine, the whisper of tires on pavement, the rush of air past windows sealed tight against the October chill. But something in the pattern caught my attention, made me listen more closely, made me realize that what I was hearing wasn't random. Names, dates, coordinates. The voice read them in sequence, one after another, with pauses between each entry that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Margaret Ann Sullivan, October 23, 2024. 37.215 6, negativ 79.941 4. Abpause. William Robert Chen, Oktober 24, 2024. 35.5951, negative 82.5515. Another pause. Patricia Lynn Morrison, October 24, 2024, 36.0726, negative 79.792. I didn't know these people. The names meant nothing to me, strangers in a world full of strangers. Their lives summarized in 3 data points that I couldn't interpret. I assumed it was some kind of memorial broadcast, a tribute to the dead or a prayer for the dying, the kind of thing small religious stations sometimes aired in the mountains where faith ran deep and traditions ran deeper. Then I heard my name, Christopher David Mercer, November 15, 2024, 36.1451, negative 79.8487. I nearly drove off the road. My hands jerked the wheel without conscious thought, sending my car toward the guardrail before I corrected, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I knew I had misheard, had to have misheard. There was no way a radio station I had never encountered, on a frequency I had found by accident, could know my name, my full legal name including the middle name I never used, the name that existed only on my birth certificate and my driver's license, and official documents I rarely saw. The voice continued without pause. More names, more dates, more coordinates that meant nothing to me but which felt increasingly ominous, increasingly wrong, increasingly like something I should not be hearing. I pulled over at the next overlook, a small gravel lot that hung over a valley I couldn't see in the darkness. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio dial, trying to change the station, trying to find anything other than the voice that had just spoken my name with the same calm certainty it had used for everyone else. The dial wouldn't turn. I twisted it left, right, pushed it in, pulled it out. Nothing worked. The knob spun freely in my grip, disconnected from any mechanism that might have controlled the frequency, as if the radio had decided to lock onto this station and had disabled any means of changing it. I tried the power button, same result. The knob turned without resistance, spinning round and round without ever catching on anything that might have turned the radio off. I tried pressing it, holding it, every combination I could think of. The voice continued through my speakers, reading names and dates and coordinates, with a patience that felt infinite. Thomas Earl Franklin, November 16, 2024, 35,271, 80,88431. Jennifer Marie Watson, November 17, 2024, 36.462, negativ 78.917. Christopher David Mercer, November 12, 2024, 36.1451, negative 79.8487. My name again. The same coordinates, I had memorized them by now, though I didn't know what location they represented, but a different date. Closer, 3 days closer than before. November 12th instead of November 15th. As if something had changed in the time since the first reading. As if the schedule had been moved up. As if whatever was supposed to happen to me had been accelerated by the simple fact of my attention. I ripped the radio from the dashboard. It wasn't easy. These things are designed to stay in place, secured with brackets and wiring that requires tools to properly remove. But I had my hands, and I had fear pumping adrenaline through my body, and I had a need to make it stop that overwhelmed any concern for property damage or personal injury. I grabbed the unit with both hands and pulled, feeling screws tear through plastic, feeling wires snap with little sparks that stung my fingers, feeling the whole assembly come free from the dash in a shower of debris that scattered across my passenger seat. I threw it into the ravine, didn't think about it, just rolled down my window and hurled the radio as far as I could into the darkness beyond the guardrail, watching it disappear into a void I couldn't measure, listening for the sound of impact that took far too long to arrive. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes, just breathing, just letting my heart rate return to something approaching normal. My hands were bleeding slightly from where the torn metal had cut them. My dashboard had a ragged hole where the radio had been, wires hanging loose, the interior lights flickering occasionally as damaged connections made intermittent contact. I drove home in silence. Total silence. No radio, no phone audio, nothing but the sound of my engine and my tires and my own breathing as I navigated curves. I could barely see through eyes that wouldn't stop watering for reasons I couldn't explain. The first thing I did when I got home was check the coordinates. I typed them into my phone with fingers that still shook, watching the map app zoom in on a location I recognized immediately. 36.1451, negative 79.8487. It was my apartment building, the precise center of the parking lot where I had just parked my car, where I was sitting right now, where I would presumably be on November 12th if I didn't do something to change my location. The second thing I did was search for the radio station. I couldn't find it. No station matched the frequency I had been listening to. No broadcaster in the region aired anything like what I had heard. The voice, the names, the dates, the coordinates, none of it appeared in any database I could access, any forum I could find, any record of any broadcast anywhere in the mountains of Virginia or North Carolina. The station didn't exist, had never existed, had somehow appeared on my radio anyway, had locked itself into my speakers, had spoken my name and a date and coordinates with a certainty that suggested prophecy rather than coincidence. I left Greensboro the next morning, packed a bag, got in my damaged car, and drove until I found a motel 200 miles away, in a town small enough that it didn't appear on most maps, anonymous enough that I hoped whatever had found me on that mountain road couldn't find me here. It's November 11th now. Tomorrow is the date the voice spoke the second time, November 12th. The day something is supposed to happen at coordinates that match my apartment, that match the place I would have been if I hadn't heard my name on a radio station that doesn't exist. I don't know if distance matters. Don't know if running has done anything except delay the inevitable. Bought me time I don't know how to use. Put me in a motel room instead of a parking lot when whatever is supposed to happen finally happens. But I've been thinking about the other names. The ones I heard before mine, the ones I heard after. Margaret Ann Sullivan, William Robert Chen, Patricia Lynn Morrison. Real people, presumably, with real lives, with dates and coordinates that mark something about their futures. Were they warned too? Did they hear their names on radios that couldn't be turned off, pull over on mountain roads, rip speakers from dashboards and throw them into ravines? Or did they drive on without hearing? Did the voice speak their names to cars full of distracted people? People listening without really listening? People who never realized that the broadcast wasn't a memorial for the dead but a schedule for the dying? I've searched for the names online, found obituaries for some of them, death notices dated exactly as the voice had predicted, causes listed as accidents and heart attacks, and the sudden unexplained failures that medicine calls natural, but which feel increasingly unnatural the more I think about them. Margaret Ann Sullivan died on October 23rd. Car accident near the coordinates the voice had spoken. William Robert Chen died on October 24th. Heart failure at an address that matched his geographic position to within meters. The pattern is clear. The predictions are accurate. The voice on the radio knew something about these people that they didn't know about themselves, and whatever it knew came true exactly as it was spoken. My date is tomorrow. My coordinates are 200 miles away, in a parking lot I'm not planning to visit, in a city I've fled from like it was on fire. Maybe that's enough. Maybe changing my location changes whatever the voice was predicting. Maybe the prophecy only works if you're where you're supposed to be. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the coordinates are just where they'll find me afterward, where the body will turn up, where the obituary will say I took my last breath regardless of how far I run or how hard I try to escape. I'm writing this because I need someone to know. Need there to be a record of what I heard, what I experienced, what drove me from my home and my job and my ordinary life into a motel room that smells like cigarettes and desperation. If tomorrow comes and goes and nothing happens, I'll delete this and pretend I overreacted, pretend the radio was a glitch, and the names were coincidence, and the dates were nothing but the universe playing tricks on a tired mind. But if tomorrow comes and I don't survive it, I want someone to understand why I ran. Want someone to know about the voice on the radio, the station that doesn't exist, the broadcast that reads names and dates and coordinates, with the certainty of something that has never been wrong. I don't know what it is, don't know why it chooses some people and not others, why it broadcasts its schedules on frequencies that can't be found, why it allows its targets to hear their own names, if there's nothing they can do to change what's coming. I only know that it knew my name, knew it before I introduced myself, before I tuned into its frequency, before I even knew that something was listening in the mountains, keeping track of us all, reading out our endings like a radio host announcing the evening's program. The clock on my nightstand says 11:47 p.m. November 11th has 13 minutes left. Whatever happens next, I want you to know I tried. I ran. I hid. I did everything I could think of to be somewhere other than where the voice said I would be. But some part of me knows it won't matter. Knows that when they find me, wherever they find me, the coordinates will match, the date will match. Everything the voice predicted will come true, because whatever spoke my name on that radio was reading from a script that was written before I was born. I'm not ready for it to end, but I'm starting to think that readiness has nothing to do with it. The countdown is almost at 0, and I'm running out of miles to run. I've driven the Blue Ridge Parkway more times than I can count. It's been part of my life since I was 16, when my father first let me take the wheel on a family trip through the mountains, teaching me to navigate curves that demanded respect and rewarded patience. After he passed, the parkway became a kind of pilgrimage for me, a way to feel connected to someone who was no longer there. I drove it in spring when the wildflowers bloomed, and in fall when the leaves turned, and in winter when ice made every curve a prayer. I knew every mile marker, every overlook, every tunnel that burrowed through mountains, too stubborn to be driven around. There are 26 tunnels on the Blue Ridge Parkway. I can name them all. Pine Mountain, Rough Ridge, Farron Knob. 3 of them share that name, Frying Pan, Little Switzerland. Each one has a length and a character, and a particular way the light changes as you enter and exit. I've driven through them so many times that I could probably navigate them blindfolded, following the rhythm of darkness and light that has become as familiar as my own heartbeat. That's why what happened in October made no sense. That's why I've spent the months since trying to convince myself that I imagined it, that fatigue or grief or some combination of the two created a hallucination so vivid it felt more real than anything I've experienced before or since. I was driving south, somewhere between Blowing Rock and Linville, on a stretch of parkway I could have traced in my sleep. It was late, past 11, and I was alone on the road, the way you often are on weeknights in autumn, when the tourists have gone home and the locals have better things to do than drive a scenic highway in the dark. My headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating 50 feet of road at a time, the mountains rising on my left and falling away on my right, in shapes I could feel more than see. I came around a curve near mile marker 305, expecting the road to continue its familiar pattern of turns and straightaways, and found myself facing a tunnel I had never seen before. It stretched ahead of me like a throat, the entrance a perfect circle carved into the mountainside, wider than any tunnel on the parkway should be. My headlights penetrated maybe 20 feet into the darkness before being swallowed entirely, absorbed by a blackness that seemed more solid than the absence of light. The walls glistened with moisture, reflecting my high beams in patterns that looked almost organic, almost alive, as if the tunnel was made of something other than rock and concrete. I stopped the car, sat there with my engine idling, staring at an entrance that shouldn't have existed, that occupied space where I knew with the certainty of dozens of drives nothing but open road should be. My mind cycled through explanations. Construction I hadn't heard about, a detour I had missed, a turn I had taken without realizing, putting me on a stretch of road I didn't recognize. But I hadn't turned. I was on the parkway, the same parkway I had been driving for an hour, and the mile markers matched what I expected, and the curves before this point had been exactly where they should be. There was no construction. There was no detour. There was only this tunnel, appearing where no tunnel had ever been, waiting for me with patience that felt almost hungry. I should have turned around. Every instinct I had, every lesson my father had taught me about mountain driving, said to trust my memory over my eyes, to back up and find another route, to acknowledge that something was wrong even if I couldn't explain what. But I didn't. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for the tunnel to vanish, waiting to wake up from whatever dream had put it there. And when nothing changed, when the entrance continued to gape at me like a mouth, I put my car in drive and went in. The darkness was immediate and total. My headlights, which had seemed so bright on the open road, became dim cones of illumination that barely reached the walls on either side. The tunnel was wider than it should have been, wide enough for 4 lanes of traffic, though only 2 were marked. The extra space on either side stretching into shadows my lights couldn't penetrate. I checked my phone immediately. No signal. Not unusual in the mountains, but the speed at which it had dropped from 2 bars to nothing in the space of seconds felt wrong. I reached for my radio, hoping to find a station that might orient me, and heard only static, but not normal static. This pulsed, rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, as if something in the tunnel was exhaling through my speakers. The tunnel went on, and on, and on. I drove at a steady 30 miles an hour, watching my odometer tick upward, waiting for the exit that should have appeared within a few hundred feet. 1/10 of a mile passed, then 2/10, then half a mile, a full mile, 2 miles. Distances that no tunnel on the Blue Ridge Parkway could possibly accommodate. The parkway's longest tunnel is around a 1/4 mile. I was already past that, and still the darkness stretched ahead of me, curving now, bending to the left in ways that made no sense, descending when the road should have stayed level. The first car appeared around the 3-mile mark. It was parked against the right wall, pulled over as if the driver had stopped for an emergency, and then simply vanished. A sedan, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the dim light, with its driver's door hanging open and its interior light on. I slowed as I passed, catching a glimpse of the seats inside. Empty. No driver, no passengers, no sign of anyone except the open door and the dome light that should have drained the battery hours ago, but which glowed steadily as I passed. There were more cars after that, dozens of them, parked at irregular intervals along both walls, their doors open, their interiors illuminated, their occupants nowhere to be seen. A minivan with car seats in the back. A pickup truck with tools scattered across the bed. A sports car that looked brand new, its paint gleaming in my headlights, its leather seats empty and clean. Each one seemed frozen in a moment of abandonment, as if the drivers had simply stopped, opened their doors, and walked away into a darkness that offered nothing but more darkness. I didn't stop, didn't slow down more than necessary, just drove past them with my hands tied on the wheel and my heart pounding in my chest, trying not to look too closely, trying not to count them, trying not to wonder what had happened to the people who had driven these cars into a tunnel that shouldn't exist and had apparently never driven out. The tunnel curved and descended, in a spiral that I couldn't track but could feel in my inner ear, a wrongness in my sense of direction that suggested I was far underground, far deeper than any mountain road should go. The walls continued to glisten, the moisture catching my headlights and throwing them back in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the static on my radio continued to pulse, that breathing rhythm that felt less like interference and more like communication with each passing minute. I lost track of time, lost track of distance, lost track of everything except the circle of illumination my headlights created and the endless darkness that surrounded it. At some point, I stopped watching my odometer, stopped checking my clock, stopped doing anything except driving forward, because forward was the only direction that made sense, even when nothing else did. The exit appeared without warning. One moment I was in the tunnel, surrounded by darkness and abandoned cars and walls that glistened with moisture I tried not to examine too closely. The next, I could see light ahead, not the artificial light of tunnel exits, but moonlight, silver and cold, forming a circle that grew larger as I approached. I accelerated without thinking, pushing my car toward that circle with a desperation that felt almost physical, and emerged onto a stretch of parkway I recognized immediately. I was near Cherokee, 60 miles from where I had entered the tunnel, on a completely different section of the parkway, at a spot I knew well, because it was where my father and I had always stopped for breakfast on our drives through the mountains. I pulled over and checked my phone. The signal was back, 2 bars, enough to show me the time. It was 2:47 a.m. I had entered the tunnel a little after 11. Nearly 4 hours had passed, though it had felt like maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. I sat there until dawn. Couldn't bring myself to drive any further. Couldn't process what had happened. Couldn't do anything except watch the sky lighten and try to convince myself that I had fallen asleep at the wheel, that I had dreamed the tunnel and the cars and the 3 hours I couldn't account for. But my gas tank told a different story. It had been nearly full when I entered the tunnel. Now it was below a quarter, as if I had driven far further than 60 miles, as if the odometer I had stopped watching had continued to tick upward through distances I couldn't comprehend. I drove that stretch of parkway again 2 weeks later, daylight this time, with a friend in the passenger seat, someone who could verify what I saw or didn't see. We passed mile marker 305, navigated the curve where the tunnel had appeared, and found nothing but open road. The parkway ran along a ridgeline there, with clear views on both sides, no mountains close enough to tunnel through, no signs of construction or detours or anything that might explain what I had experienced. My friend asked why I had wanted to drive this particular stretch. I made up something about the views, about autumn colors I wanted to photograph, about nothing that came anywhere close to the truth. I've been back since then, many times, always in daylight, always with someone else in the car, always half hoping and half dreading that the tunnel will appear again. It never has. The road remains open, exposed, exactly as it should be, exactly as it has been for the decades since the parkway was built. But I dream about it. Almost every night now, I dream about driving through darkness that never ends, past cars whose drivers vanished into something they couldn't see, through a tunnel that exists outside of space and time and any map that's ever been drawn of these mountains. In the dreams, I stop the car, open the door, step out into the darkness, and walk toward the glistening walls that reflect light that isn't there. I walk until I reach the other cars, the ones with their doors hanging open, and I look inside and see people sitting in the driver's seats. People who look at me with eyes that have adjusted to darkness, with expressions that suggest they've been waiting, with mouths that open to speak words I wake up before I can hear. I don't know what happened that night. Don't know where the tunnel came from, or where it goes, or what happened to the people whose cars I passed in that impossible darkness. Don't know if I drove through something that exists in the mountains, or something that exists only in the space between one moment and the next, a pocket of reality that opens sometimes for reasons no one understands. But I know the tunnel was real. Know it with the certainty of someone who drove through it, who watched his gas tank empty and his clock advance, who emerged 60 miles from where he entered with hours he couldn't account for and memories he couldn't explain. And I know that somewhere in those mountains, in a darkness that no headlight can penetrate, there are cars still parked along glistening walls, their doors still open, their drivers still missing. I just hope I never find out where they went. I just hope I never have to go back and find out what's waiting in that darkness, what speaks through static that sounds like breathing, what called all those people out of their cars and into a tunnel that doesn't exist except when it wants to be found. Some roads shouldn't be driven at night. Some tunnels shouldn't be entered at all. And some exits only let you out because something down there decided to let you go. The night shift at the distribution center in Asheville ended at 2 in the morning, which meant I was usually on the Blue Ridge Parkway by 2:30, driving north toward my apartment in Boone through darkness. So complete it felt like driving through ink. Most people would have taken the interstate faster, safer, better lit, but I had grown up in these mountains, and the parkway felt like home in ways that a highway full of tractor trailers never could. Besides, at that hour, the road was mine alone. No tourists stopping for photographs. No RVs crawling up hills at 15 miles an hour. Just me and the curves in the mountains that had been there long before anyone thought to build a road through them. It was October, maybe a week before Halloween, and the weather had turned cold earlier than usual. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed 34 degrees, cold enough that I was running my heater at full blast and still feeling the chill seep through my windows. The sky was clear but moonless, Stars scattered across the black in patterns I had learned to recognize from years of late-night drives. Orion was rising in the east. The Milky Way stretched across the horizon like a river of light too distant to offer any illumination. I saw him at an overlook near mile marker 310. At first, I thought he was a shadow. The overlook was just a wide spot in the road, a place where cars could pull over to enjoy views that were invisible in the darkness. And shapes there often turned out to be nothing: trash cans, interpretive signs, the stumps of trees that had been cut down years ago. But this shape moved, raised an arm as my headlights swept across it, stepped toward the road in the universal gesture of someone who needed help. Company policy said never pick up hitchhikers. I had signed a form when I started the job, a liability waiver that included a list of prohibited behaviors, and picking up strangers was near the top. Common sense said the same thing. The parkway was isolated, the hour was late, and the news was full of stories about drivers who had stopped to help and had regretted it for whatever remained of their shortened lives. But the man looked so ordinary. That's what I remember most, even now. He wasn't wild-eyed or disheveled or carrying signs of the kind of desperation that should have triggered my survival instincts. He was just a man, middle-aged, wearing a jacket that looked too thin for the weather, standing at an overlook in the middle of the night with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for a very long time. I pulled over before I could convince myself not to. He walked to the passenger side with a gait that seemed slightly off, slightly stiff, as if his joints didn't quite work the way joints were supposed to work. He opened the door and climbed in, bringing with him a rush of cold air and a smell I couldn't identify, something old and organic, like dried leaves or pressed flowers, or the particular mustiness of rooms that haven't been opened in years. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, unused, carrying a quality that made me think of someone who had been alone for so long they had forgotten how to speak. "I've been waiting a long time for a ride. Where are you headed?" "Blowing Rock. There's a house there that's been waiting for me since before you were born." I didn't know what to make of that. Assumed it was a figure of speech, a poetic way of describing a childhood home or a family property, something that held meaning beyond the literal words. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the parkway, resuming my journey north with a passenger I hadn't expected and couldn't quite explain. He was quiet for the first few miles. I stole glances at him when the road was straight enough to allow it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. His face was lined but not old, weathered in a way that suggested exposure to elements rather than the simple passage of time. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, watching the curves appear and disappear in my headlights with an attention that seemed almost hungry. His hands were folded in his lap, perfectly still, not fidgeting the way most passengers fidget when they're in a stranger's car. "I used to drive this road," he said, breaking the silence so suddenly that I jumped. "Back when it was new. Back when the overlooks were still being built and the tunnels still smelled like dynamite." "That must have been a long time ago," I said, not sure what else to say. "Longer than you'd believe. The parkway was different then, wilder. The construction crews would tell stories about things they saw in the hollows, things they heard at night when they were camping near the work sites. Most people thought they were just stories. But I knew better. I drove this road enough to know that some places hold on to things, some places don't let go." He talked for the next hour, told me stories about the parkway I had never heard, about people who had disappeared on these curves, about cars that had been found abandoned, with no explanation, and bodies that had been discovered in ravines that search parties had already checked. He spoke of the original workers who had built the road, men who had come from all over Appalachia to carve a highway through mountains that didn't want to be carved, who had died in accidents that the official reports called mishaps, but which the survivors called something else entirely. I listened because I couldn't not listen. His voice had a quality that made silence impossible, a cadence that filled my car and my head and left no room for anything except the words he was speaking. I should have been tired. I'd been awake for 18 hours. Had worked a full shift moving boxes in a warehouse that never got warm enough, but his stories kept me alert, kept me focused, kept me driving through darkness that seemed to press closer with every mile. He told me about the things that lived in the hollows below the ridgeline. Not animals, he said, though they were often mistaken for animals by the people who were lucky enough to see them and survive. Something older, something that had been in these mountains since before humans learned to walk upright, that watched the parkway from shadows that sunlight never reached. that came out at night to study the cars and the drivers and the endless stream of people who passed through their territory without ever knowing what was watching. They don't usually interfere, he said. They just watch. They've been watching for so long that watching is all they know how to do. But sometimes, when someone catches their attention, when someone drives through the wrong stretch of road at the wrong time of night, they make exceptions. What kind of exceptions? He didn't answer, just smiled in a way that made my stomach clench, and continued talking about other things, other stories, other warnings about a road I had driven 1,000 times without ever realizing what I was driving through. Dawn began to lighten the sky ahead of us as we approached Blowing Rock. The first gray hints of sunrise, pushing back the darkness that had held us all night, revealing mountains I had seen so often I barely noticed them anymore. I felt the exhaustion hit me then, the accumulated weight of 18 hours without sleep crashing down all at once. And I knew I needed to stop soon, needed to find a place to pull over and close my eyes before I became one of the statistics my passenger had been describing. "This is close enough," he said. "Pull over here. I can walk from here." I stopped at an overlook near mile marker 295. The view would be spectacular in a few minutes, once the sun fully crested the eastern ridges. But for now it was just gray and shadow, shapes suggesting themselves without fully revealing what they were. I turned to say goodbye. The seat beside me was empty. I sat there for a long moment, staring at leather that should have held a man I had driven 50 miles. A man who had talked without stopping for an hour. A man who had climbed into my car at an overlook that now seemed impossibly far behind us. The seat was empty. The seatbelt hung unused, exactly as it had been when I had picked him up. Never fastened, never touched. The door had never been opened. I would have felt the rush of cold air, would have heard the chime that sounded whenever a door was ajar, but he was gone. Simply gone, as if he had never been there at all. But on the leather, in the center of the seat where he had been sitting, was a photograph. I picked it up with hands that had started to shake. The image was faded and cracked, the colors washed out to sepia by decades of exposure to light. It showed a man standing beside a car, one hand resting on the hood, the other hanging at his side. The car was something from another era, a model that hadn't been manufactured in 40 years or more, with fins and chrome and a shape that belonged to roads that no longer existed. The man was the passenger I had just been talking to. Same face, same weathered features, same expression of patient waiting that I had been looking at for the past hour. He was wearing the same jacket, the same clothes, standing beside a car that had been new when my parents were children. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting so faded I could barely read it, was a name and a date. James Edward Whitmore, the 29th of October, 1978. I looked up at the road ahead of me, at the mountains that were slowly revealing themselves in the growing light, at the parkway that wound through them like a scar through flesh, carrying drivers from one end to the other, past overlooks where people waited and hollows where things watched and curves that had claimed more lives than anyone wanted to count. James Edward Whitmore, the 29th of October, 1978. The same date that was circled on my dashboard calendar. Tomorrow, no, today, I realized, looking at the sunrise that had just begun. October 29th. The anniversary of something I didn't understand, something that had apparently been repeating for 46 years, something that had finally included me in its cycle. I drove home. What else could I do? Drove to my apartment in Boone, parked in my usual spot, walked up the stairs to my door, with the photograph still clutched in my hand. I tried to convince myself that I had dreamed the whole thing, that exhaustion had created a hallucination so vivid it had left physical evidence, that there was some explanation that didn't require me to believe in things that couldn't exist. But the photograph was real. The stories were real. I looked them up later, found archives and newspaper clippings that matched what he had told me, deaths and disappearances that had been written off as accidents or mysteries, or the inevitable cost of building a road through mountains that didn't want to be crossed. And James Edward Whitmore was real. I found his obituary in a Blowing Rock paper from 1978. He had died on October 29th, found in his car at an overlook near mile marker 310, cause of death listed as exposure. He had been waiting for a ride home, according to the article, had pulled over because his car wouldn't start, had been found the next morning by a park ranger who had been checking the overlooks after a cold night. He had frozen to death, waiting for someone to stop. And for 46 years, Apparently, he had kept waiting, kept flagging down cars, kept climbing into passenger seats and telling stories about a parkway he had loved and a home he was trying to reach and things that lived in hollows that most people never knew existed. I don't drive the parkway at night anymore. Don't put myself in places where something might be waiting, where patience and loneliness have combined into something that refuses to let go. I took a different job, day shifts at a grocery store in Boone, hours that let me be home before dark and asleep before the deepest hours of the night. But I still have the photograph. Keep it in my nightstand drawer, next to the flashlight and the phone charger, and all the other ordinary objects that fill ordinary lives. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I take it out and look at it, at the man beside the car, at the face that was so ordinary it convinced me to stop when everything else said to keep driving. I wonder if he found his way home. I wonder if the ride I gave him counted, if letting someone out at an overlook near Blowing Rock was enough to end whatever cycle he had been caught in. But mostly, I wonder how many other people have picked him up over the years. How many drivers have pulled over at mile marker 310, have let a cold man into their passenger seats, have listened to stories about a parkway that holds on to things and doesn't let go. And I wonder if any of them ever looked at the photograph and recognized themselves. If any of them realized that the cycle doesn't need a driver, it just needs someone willing to wait. The first time I saw the wreck was on a November evening, about 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had been driving the Blue Ridge Parkway for years by then, using it as a commute between my job in Asheville and my apartment in Spruce Pine, a route that added 30 minutes to my travel time, but which I preferred to the interstate, for reasons I could never quite articulate. There was something about the parkway that felt sacred, that demanded attention in ways that ordinary roads didn't, that made driving feel like participation rather than transportation. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of autumn night when the air has an edge to it and the sunset paints the mountains in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. I was driving north, taking the curves at the particular speed that years of experience had taught me was safe but not slow, when I came around a bend near mile marker 355 and saw the car. It was crumpled against the guardrail, the front end compressed into a shape that metal should never take, the windshield shattered into a spiderweb of cracks that caught my headlights and threw them back in fragments. The vehicle was dark, no lights on, no hazards flashing, sitting at an angle that suggested violent impact followed by absolute stillness. I couldn't tell what color it was in the fading light, couldn't identify the make or model through the damage, could only see that it was a sedan of some kind, and that whoever had been driving was probably in serious trouble. I pulled over immediately, left my car running with the headlights on, grabbed my phone from the console, ran toward the wreck with the particular urgency that comes from believing you might be the difference between life and death. My feet crunched on broken glass that had scattered across the pavement, shards that caught the light from my car and sparkled like the aftermath of something terrible. The driver's side door was already open, hanging at an angle that suggested force rather than intention. I reached the car and looked inside, expecting to find someone injured, someone trapped, someone who needed the help I was desperately hoping I could provide. The car was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty in a way that felt wrong, that carried a quality of abandonment that went beyond the simple absence of a driver. The seats were cold when I touched them, as if no one had sat there in hours or days or longer. There was no blood, no sign of injury, no indication that anyone had been present when the crash occurred. Just an empty vehicle, crumpled against a guardrail, waiting for someone to find it. I checked the back seat. Empty. Checked the passenger side. Empty. Walked around the car looking for footprints, for drag marks, for any evidence that someone had walked away from this wreck or been carried away by emergency responders. Found nothing. The car sat in isolation, surrounded by glass and metal debris, as alone as anything I had ever seen. I called 911, reported the accident, gave my location as best I could, described what I was seeing in a voice that sounded strange even to my own ears. The dispatcher took my information with a professionalism that seemed slightly off, slightly knowing, as if this call was not unexpected. "We'll send someone out," she said. "Stay with the vehicle if you can, but don't be surprised if things change before they arrive." "What do you mean change?" She didn't answer, just told me a ranger would be there within 20 minutes, and ended the call with a click that felt more final than any disconnection should. I stayed. What else could I do? I walked back to my car and turned on my hazard lights, creating a flashing beacon that would warn any other drivers about the obstruction ahead. Then I stood at the edge of the road, watching the wrecked car, waiting for help that the dispatcher had promised, but which her tone had suggested might not make any difference. The ranger arrived in 18 minutes. I know because I checked my phone compulsively, counting the time, needing something concrete to hold on to in a situation that had started to feel increasingly unreal. His vehicle came around the bend with lights flashing, pulled up behind mine, and a man in a uniform got out and walked toward me with a flashlight in one hand and an expression on his face that I couldn't read. "You called about the accident?" he asked. I turned to point at the wreck. The curve was empty. No car, no debris, no guardrail damage. The road stretched ahead of us, clean and clear, and completely ordinary, as if nothing had ever happened there. My headlights illuminated pavement that should have been covered in broken glass, guardrails that should have been crumpled and bent, space that should have held a wrecked sedan and instead held nothing at all. I stood there with my mouth open, trying to find words for what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the evidence of my senses with the memory of what had been there just minutes before. I had touched that car, had felt the cold leather of the seats, had crunched across glass that couldn't have cleaned itself up, couldn't have vanished in the time it took for a ranger to drive from wherever he had been to this stretch of road. "It was right there," I said, pointing at empty space. "A wrecked car, against the guardrail. I touched it. I looked inside." The ranger nodded in a way that suggested he had heard this before. Not skeptical, exactly, but not surprised either. The expression of someone who has learned to accept things that don't make sense because fighting them is a waste of energy. "People report wrecks at this curve all the time," he said. "Always the same description. Dark sedan, crumpled against the guardrail, empty when they look inside. By the time we get here, it's always gone. No car, no damage, no evidence that anything happened." "That's impossible." "I know." He clicked off his flashlight and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much to be moved by one more impossible thing. "Something happened at this curve a long time ago, before my time on the force. Before most people's time, if I'm being honest. Whatever it was, the Parkway remembers it, keeps showing it to people on nights when the conditions are right." "What conditions?" He shrugged. "Cold nights, clear skies, solo drivers. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you. Some people see it once and never again. Others see it every time they drive this stretch after dark. There's no pattern that anyone's been able to figure out." "What happened? Who died here?" He looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding whether to answer. Then he shook his head. "I don't know the details. The records from back then are incomplete, if they exist at all. But I can tell you this, whatever happened at this curve, whoever died here, they haven't left. They keep replaying the crash over and over for reasons no one understands. And lately," he trailed off, his face changing in ways I couldn't interpret. "Lately what?" "Nothing, just stories. Things other witnesses have reported that I don't put much stock in." He handed me a card with his name and number on it. "If you see it again, call me directly. Don't bother with 911. They'll just send someone else who doesn't know the history." I took the card and watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the curve that had held a wrecked car minutes before and now held nothing at all. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the crash to reappear and prove that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. It didn't. The curve stayed empty. The night stayed quiet. Eventually, I got back in my car and drove home, taking the curve slowly, checking my mirrors constantly, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from spaces I couldn't see. I saw the wreck again 3 months later. February this time, a night so cold that my breath frosted the inside of my windshield every time I exhaled. I was coming around the same curve, the one near mile marker 355, when my headlights caught the familiar shape of metal against guardrail, the familiar pattern of shattered glass, the familiar silhouette of a car that shouldn't have been there. I didn't stop this time. Didn't pull over, didn't call for help, didn't do anything except slow down and stare as I passed, trying to see details I had missed the first time, trying to understand what I was looking at and why it kept appearing on nights when I least expected it. The car looked the same, dark sedan, crumpled front end, driver's door hanging open. But this time, as I passed, I could have sworn I saw something different, A shape in the driver's seat, a shadow that suggested shoulders and a head, someone sitting behind the wheel of a vehicle that had been empty 3 months ago. I didn't stop to check, just accelerated around the curve and drove the rest of the way home, with my heart pounding and my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I called the ranger the next morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice heavy with the particular weariness of someone who has been expecting bad news. "You saw it again," he said. Not a question. There was someone in the car this time, in the driver's seat. Silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought he might have hung up. "That's what others have reported," he said finally. "The ones who see it more than twice. The figure appears gradually. First the car is empty, then there's a shadow, then a shape, then what? Then a face, one they recognize." I didn't ask what that meant, didn't want to know. Thanked him for his time and ended the call and tried to convince myself that I would never drive that stretch of parkway again, that I would take the interstate like everyone else, that I would avoid mile marker 355 until whatever was there got tired of waiting for me. It lasted 4 months. 4 months of longer commutes and boring highways and the constant nagging feeling that I was running from something I didn't understand. By June, I had convinced myself that the whole thing had been a combination of fatigue and imagination, that the ranger had been humoring me with ghost stories, that there was no wrecked car and no figure and no reason to be afraid of a curve. I had driven 1,000 times before the night I saw something that wasn't there. I took the parkway again on a Wednesday evening in June. The days were long, the sun still up when I left work, and I told myself that whatever happened at mile marker 355 only happened at night, only happened when the conditions were right, only happened to people who were looking for something to see. The wreck appeared around the curve as it always had. I saw it from a distance this time, had a few seconds to prepare myself before I reached the spot where it always waited. The car was there, crumpled and broken, exactly as I remembered it. And in the driver's seat, clearly visible through the shattered windshield, was a figure that hadn't been there the first time, that had been only a shadow the second time, that was now solid and present and turning to look at me as I approached. I should have looked away, should have kept my eyes on the road, should have passed without acknowledging what I was seeing, should have done anything except what I actually did. I looked at the face. It was mine. Same features, same expression, same particular way my eyes crinkled at the corners when I was afraid. The figure in the driver's seat of the wrecked car was me, sitting behind a wheel that had been bent by impact, trapped in a vehicle that had been crumpled by force, watching myself drive past with an expression that held something I couldn't name: recognition, maybe, or warning, or the particular sorrow of someone who knows what's coming and can't do anything to stop it. I passed the wreck without stopping, drove the rest of the way home in a daze, my mind racing through explanations that made no sense, possibilities that I didn't want to consider, fears that I couldn't put into words but which had taken root in some deep part of my brain and refused to let go. I looked up accidents on that stretch of parkway, spent hours searching through archives and newspaper databases, and the kind of online forums where people share stories about things they can't explain. I found reports of the crash site dating back decades, witnesses who described the same car in the same position, with the same impossible tendency to vanish before help could arrive. But I couldn't find any record of the original accident, no obituary, no police report, no evidence that anyone had ever actually died at mile marker 355, until I found the newspaper from 1987. It was a small article, buried in the back pages of an Asheville paper that had since gone out of business. A single-car accident on the Blue Ridge Parkway. A driver who had lost control on a curve, had crashed through the guardrail, had been found the next morning by rangers who had been responding to reports of a wreck that witnesses described, but couldn't quite locate. The driver's name was different from mine. The date was 36 years before my first sighting, but the photograph that accompanied the article showed a face I recognized immediately. It was me, not someone who looked like me, not a distant relative with similar features. Me, the same face I had seen in the driver's seat of the wrecked car, the same face I saw every morning in my bathroom mirror. I've stopped driving the parkway entirely now. Take the interstate even though it adds an hour to my commute, even though the tolls are eating into my paycheck, even though everyone thinks I'm crazy for avoiding a road I used to love. I don't know what I saw at mile marker 355. Don't know why the driver of a car that crashed 36 years ago looks exactly like me. Don't know if what I'm seeing is a ghost, a warning, a glimpse of a future I haven't lived yet, or something else entirely that I don't have words to describe. But I know that every night, somewhere on the Blue Ridge Parkway, a car sits crumpled against a guardrail that shows no damage. A driver waits behind a wheel that bent on impact. A face that looks like mine watches the road, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for someone to recognize what they're seeing, waiting for something that I'm terrified might be me. The ranger told me that the figure appears gradually, first empty, then a shadow, then a shape, then a face. He didn't tell me what comes after the face, and I'm not sure I want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and trying not to think about mile marker 355, I wonder if the reason the original driver was never identified is because he hadn't been born yet. I wonder if the accident that keeps replaying itself isn't a memory of the past but a preview of the future. I wonder if the face in the driver's seat has always been mine, waiting for me to catch up to a moment that has already happened and hasn't happened yet. And I wonder how many more times I'll see that wreck before I become the one sitting behind the wheel, watching myself drive past, unable to warn myself about what's coming around the next curve. My car is a 2019 Honda Accord, dark blue, purchased new from a dealership in Charlotte 3 months before the night I'm about to describe. I chose it specifically because of its reliability rating, because Consumer Reports said it would start every time and run without complaint for 200,000 miles if I treated it right. I'm the kind of person who treats cars right. Oil changes every 5,000 miles, tire rotations on schedule, the kind of meticulous maintenance that mechanics appreciate but rarely see, that keeps vehicles running long past the point when other people would have traded them in for something newer. In the 2 years I had owned that Accord before the night at mile marker 339, it had never once failed to start, never hesitated, never sputtered, never given me any indication that the engine was anything other than the reliable piece of engineering that Honda had promised it would be. I mention this because what happened on the parkway that night had nothing to do with mechanical failure. I've had the car inspected 3 times since then, by 3 different mechanics, and none of them have found anything wrong. The engine is perfect. The electrical system is perfect. Everything that could have caused what I experienced is working exactly as it should, which means the car didn't fail. Something made it stop. I was driving home from my sister's house in Boone, taking the Blue Ridge Parkway because I had promised my wife I would pick up some apple butter from a farm stand that was only accessible from that route. The farm stand had been closed by the time I got there. It was already past 8, and most places in the mountains shut down early, but I decided to continue on the parkway anyway, rather than backtracking to the interstate. The night was clear and cold, late November, and I had driven this road enough times to feel comfortable navigating its curves even after dark. Mile marker 339 sits on a stretch of parkway that has no neighbors, no houses visible from the road, no businesses, no ranger stations within easy walking distance. The nearest cell tower is somewhere over the ridge to the east, blocked by terrain that makes signal impossible for miles in either direction. I knew this when I entered that stretch, had driven it many times before, had always made it through without incident. The engine died at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know the time because my phone, which had been showing no signal, displayed a timestamp the moment everything went dark. 1 second I was driving at 40 miles an hour, my headlights cutting clean lines through the November night, my heater humming quietly as it kept the cabin warm. The next second, nothing. The engine cut out without warning, without the gradual loss of power that indicates fuel problems, or the sputter that suggests electrical issues. Just sudden, complete silence as every system in my car shut down simultaneously. The headlights went dark, the dashboard went dark, the heater stopped. Even the dome light, which should have come on automatically when the electronics failed, stayed off. I was coasting through darkness so complete that I couldn't see the road ahead of me, couldn't see my own hands on the steering wheel, couldn't see anything except the afterimages of my headlights burning on my retinas as my eyes tried to adjust to a blackness that offered nothing to adjust to. I managed to guide the car to the shoulder by feel, using the change in texture beneath my tires to tell me when I was off the pavement. The car rolled to a stop on what I assumed was gravel, though I couldn't see it, and I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My first thought was that something had shorted out, that some electrical gremlin had killed everything at once, and that I would need to call for help. But my phone showed no signal, and even if it had, the screen had gone dark along with everything else in the car, waking only to show me the time before falling back into a sleep I couldn't rouse it from. I was stranded, on a stretch of parkway where no one would come for hours, in darkness so complete that getting out of the car and walking felt like a death sentence. That's when I heard the tapping. It started at the rear window, a soft sound, barely audible over the ringing silence that had replaced my engine's hum. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm of fingernails against glass, deliberate and slow, as if whoever was making the sound wanted me to know they were there. I froze. Didn't turn around, didn't try to look through the rear window into darkness that would show me nothing anyway. Just sat in my driver's seat with my hands still on the wheel, listening to a sound that couldn't have been what I thought it was. The tapping moved. Slowly, so slowly, that I could track its progress by the slight changes in tone. It traveled from the rear window to the left side of my car, along the back passenger window, pause, along the back door, pause, toward the front, toward me, the tapping maintaining its steady rhythm, as something circled my vehicle with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world. I held my breath, told myself it was a branch, told myself it was an animal, a curious deer or a raccoon, investigating this strange dead thing that had appeared on the side of its road. Told myself anything except the truth that my body already knew, the truth that was making my heart pound and my hands shake and my vision blur with a fear so primal it bypassed my conscious mind entirely. The tapping reached my driver's window. I could hear it clearly now, inches from my ear, separated from me by nothing but a thin sheet of glass that suddenly felt like no protection at all. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, the same patience, the same deliberate acknowledgement of my presence. Whatever was out there knew I was here, knew exactly where I was sitting, knew that I was listening. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't do anything that might acknowledge the sound, that might invite interaction, that might give whatever was outside any indication that I was aware of its presence. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed forward on darkness I couldn't see through, my ears tracking the tapping as it continued past my window and around to the front of the car. It traced the hood. I could hear it now, the sound changing from glass to metal, the tap becoming a tick as fingernails or something like fingernails moved across the surface of my engine bay. The pattern was thorough, methodical, as if whatever was out there was mapping my vehicle, learning its contours, memorizing every inch of metal that separated me from the night. The tapping moved to the passenger side. Same rhythm, same patience, same terrible deliberation. Around the front fender, along the passenger door, past the rear window, completing the circuit at the back of my car before starting again. It circled me for hours. I lost track of time. My phone had stopped responding. Its screen dark no matter how many times I pressed the power button. I had no way to know how long I sat there, frozen in my driver's seat, listening to something trace the outline of my car again and again and again. Sometimes the tapping would pause, would stop for long minutes that felt like hours, and I would start to hope that whatever it was had lost interest, had moved on, had decided I wasn't worth the attention. Then it would start again, picking up exactly where it had left off, continuing its circuit with a persistence that felt less like curiosity and more like siege. I thought about getting out, about running into the darkness, about trying to find the road, about doing anything except sitting there while something methodically examined every inch of my vehicle. But I couldn't see, couldn't know what was waiting for me outside the thin shell of metal and glass that had become my only protection. The tapping was outside. Whatever made it was outside, and as long as I stayed inside, as long as I didn't acknowledge its presence, as long as I pretended I wasn't there, maybe it would eventually leave. The tapping stopped at sunrise. I know this because I was watching the sky through my windshield when it happened. The first gray hint of dawn had been building for what felt like an eternity, that slow lightening of the horizon that comes before the sun actually crests the ridgeline. The tapping had been circling my car for what must have been the 100th time, when the gray became bright enough to see shapes, to distinguish the outline of trees against the sky, to recognize that night was ending and day was beginning. And then, silence. Not the gradual fading of a sound that loses interest, not the diminishing rhythm of something moving away. Just instant, complete silence, as if whatever had been circling my car had simply ceased to exist the moment light touched the world. I waited, sat there for another 30 minutes at least, watching the sky brighten, watching the road emerge from darkness, watching my surroundings transform from void into the ordinary landscape of the Blue Ridge Parkway. I didn't move until I could see clearly in all directions, until I could verify that there was nothing around my car, no figure standing in the trees, no shape crouching beside my wheels, nothing that might have been making the sounds I had spent the night listening to. My car started on the first try. The engine turned over immediately when I pressed the button, as if nothing had ever been wrong, as if the complete electrical failure I had experienced was a dream, or a hallucination, or anything except what I knew it had been. The dashboard lit up, the headlights came on, my phone woke in its cradle, showing a full charge and the time 6:42 a.m. I drove away without looking back, without checking my mirrors, without doing anything that might acknowledge what had surrounded me in the night. I took the parkway south until I hit the interstate, then drove straight home, breaking every speed limit, needing to be somewhere that wasn't there, somewhere that had walls and lights and other people, and all the ordinary things that darkness had stripped away. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway that I saw the scratches. They covered my car, long parallel gouges, running along every surface, tracing the exact path that the tapping had taken during the night. They started at the rear window and circled clockwise, marking the hood, the doors, the fenders, every inch of metal that something had touched while I sat frozen in my driver's seat. The scratches were deep, cutting through paint into the primer beneath, leaving trails that looked almost like writing but which I couldn't read no matter how hard I tried. I had the car repainted, told the body shop I had driven through a construction zone, had scraped against equipment I hadn't seen in the dark. They didn't question it, did the work. Gave me back a car that looked exactly as it had before I drove onto the parkway that night. The scratches came back 3 weeks later. I noticed them on a Saturday morning, walking to my car to run errands. The same pattern, the same depth, the same circuit around my vehicle, starting at the rear window and moving clockwise, as if whatever had marked it the first time was reminding me that the marks weren't mine to remove. I had it repainted again, watched them return within a month. I've stopped repainting now. The scratches are just part of my car, part of whatever relationship was established on that night at mile marker 339, a record of something I experienced that refuses to let me pretend it didn't happen. But the scratches aren't what keep me awake at night. What keeps me awake is the certainty that something is waiting, that whatever circled my car with such patience, such thoroughness, such deliberate attention, didn't lose interest when the sun came up. It just stopped, withdrew, returned to wherever it had come from until the next time the conditions were right. I haven't driven the parkway at night since then. Haven't put myself in places where cell service doesn't exist and help is hours away and darkness is absolute in ways that city dwellers never experience. I take the interstate now, even when it adds hours to my journey, even when the parkway would be faster and more beautiful and more like the roads I used to love. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, tapping on my bedroom window. The same rhythm, the same patience, the same deliberate announcement of presence that I learned to recognize on a November night when my car died at mile marker 339 and something spent hours circling me in darkness I couldn't see through. It always stops before I can make myself look, always falls silent before I can gather the courage to pull back the curtain and see what's waiting on the other side of the glass. I tell myself it's branches, tell myself it's the house settling, tell myself anything except the truth that my body already knows, the truth that makes my heart pound and my hands shake and my breath catch in my throat. Something found me on the parkway that night, something that knows where I live now, something that marked my car and followed me home and waits outside my window on nights when the conditions are right. I don't know what it wants, don't know why it chose me, why my car died at that particular spot, why I was selected for attention I never asked for and can't seem to escape. I only know that it's patient, that it has all the time in the world, that it's been waiting for something since before I was born and will continue waiting long after I'm gone. And I know that someday, on some night when my fear is less than my curiosity, I'm going to look out that window. I'm going to see what's been tapping. And I have a terrible feeling that whatever I see will be waiting for exactly that moment. The moment I finally acknowledge that it's there. The drive from Roanoke to Asheville takes about 3.5 hours if you take the interstate, closer to 5 if you follow the Blue Ridge Parkway, the way I was doing that night in late September. I had made the trip dozens of times before, usually in daylight, usually with breaks planned at overlooks and visitor centers that dotted the route like pearls on a string. But this time I was running late, had stayed too long at a friend's wedding reception, and was trying to make up time by driving straight through without stopping. By midnight, I knew I had made a mistake. The exhaustion hit me somewhere around mile marker 240, a wave of fatigue so heavy, it felt like someone had draped a weighted blanket over my brain. My eyes kept closing, not in blinks, but in long, dangerous moments of darkness that my body was choosing over my conscious protests. The road ahead would blur, then sharpen, then blur again, and each time I snapped back to attention, I found myself slightly off-center, drifting toward lines I hadn't meant to cross. I needed to stop. I knew this. I had known it for miles, but kept telling myself that just a few more minutes, just a few more curves, just a few more mile markers, and I would be close enough to push through. The lie had almost gotten me killed twice already. Jerking awake to find my tires rumbling on the shoulder, the guardrail rushing toward me in my headlights, before I corrected at the last possible moment. The rest stop appeared around a curve near mile marker 235. I had driven this stretch of parkway many times and had never seen a rest stop here. The parkway has comfort stations at various points along its length, small buildings with bathrooms and water fountains maintained by the Park Service, but I could have sworn there was nothing at this location except the road and the forest and the darkness that pressed close on both sides. But there it was, a small building set back from the road, connected to a parking lot by a short access drive. The structure was simple, utilitarian, the kind of cinder block construction that suggests government funding and practical purpose. It was lit by fluorescent lights mounted under the eaves, buzzing with that particular frequency of neglect that suggests bulbs that should have been replaced years ago but never were. I didn't question it, didn't stop to wonder why a rest stop I had never seen before was suddenly appearing on a road I knew by heart. I was too tired to question anything, too desperate for a break to care about details that seemed unimportant compared to the simple, overwhelming need to close my eyes for more than a dangerous moment. I pulled into the parking lot and stopped beside the only other vehicle there, a station wagon that looked like it had been manufactured decades before I was born. Wood paneling on the sides, chrome bumpers, the particular boxy shape of American cars from an era when fuel efficiency was a joke rather than a selling point. The plates were from a state I didn't recognize, though in my exhausted state I couldn't have said whether that was because the state was unfamiliar or because my brain had simply stopped processing new information. I got out of my car and walked toward the building. The fluorescent lights cast a pale, sickly glow over everything, washing out colors, making the parking lot look like something from a low-budget horror film. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for September, and I could see my breath forming clouds as I approached the entrance. The bathroom was on the left side of the building, a door marked with the universal symbol for men. I pushed it open and stepped into a space that felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The lights were the same fluorescent panels as outside, humming with that same frequency of neglect. The tiles on the floor were white, or had been white once, now stained with patterns I didn't want to examine too closely. There were 3 stalls and 2 urinals and a row of sinks with mirrors mounted above them. The mirrors were the first thing I noticed. I walked to the sinks and looked at my reflection, expecting to see the haggard face of someone who had been driving for too long on too little sleep. But the reflection that looked back at me was delayed. Not by much, maybe half a second, maybe less, but enough that I noticed. Enough that when I raised my hand to touch my face, the reflection raised its hand just slightly after mine, as if it was following rather than mirroring. I stepped back from the sink. The reflection stepped back too, but with that same tiny delay, that same sense of watching rather than reflecting. I turned my head left. The reflection turned a beat behind me. I turned right. Same thing. It was tracking my movements, copying them with almost perfect precision, but always a fraction of a second too slow. I told myself it was exhaustion, told myself my brain was lagging, processing visual information more slowly than it should, because I needed sleep so badly my neurons were misfiring. I stepped away from the mirror and walked toward the stalls, hoping that the relief of an empty bladder would give me enough energy to make it the rest of the way home. The stall doors were swinging, all three of them moving in slow, synchronized arcs, opening and closing with a rhythm that suggested some unseen force was pushing them. There was no wind, the bathroom had no windows, no ventilation I could see, but the doors moved anyway, hinges creaking softly in the silence, as if the building itself was breathing. I should have left then, should have recognized that something was wrong, that this rest stop and this bathroom and the mirrors that showed delayed reflections were not places I wanted to be. But I was tired, so tired, and the stalls were just stalls, and the doors were probably moving because of air pressure from the entrance I had just come through. I reached for the nearest stall door. It swung away from my hand before I could touch it, not pushed by me, not responding to my approach, but moving on its own, opening wide as if inviting me in. The stall was empty, just a toilet and a paper dispenser, and the same white tiles that covered the floor outside. Normal, ordinary, exactly what a bathroom stall should be. I stepped in and reached for the door to close it behind me. It wouldn't close. I pushed it, pulled it, tried to force it into position, but the door refused to stay shut. It would swing toward the frame, reach the point where it should have latched, and then bounce back as if something on the other side was pushing against it. I tried 3 times before giving up, accepting that I would use the facilities with the door partially open, that my privacy was less important than my desperate need to relieve myself and get back on the road. The faucets ran cold when I washed my hands. Not cool, not the moderate temperature of water that has been sitting in pipes, actually cold, the kind of cold that suggests glacier runoff or mountain springs or sources that should not have been connected to a rest stop bathroom in the middle of the Blue Ridge Parkway. I let the water run over my hands for maybe 10 seconds before pulling away, my fingers aching from the temperature, my skin already red from the brief exposure. I didn't look in the mirror again, didn't want to see if my reflection was still delayed, didn't want to confirm that what I had experienced wasn't just exhaustion playing tricks on my perception. I walked out of the bathroom and back into the parking lot, ready to get in my car and drive the remaining hours home, ready to put this strange rest stop behind me and pretend I had never stopped here at all. The station wagon was gone. I stopped in the middle of the parking lot, staring at the space where it had been. The spot was empty now, no vehicle, no indication that anything had been parked there except my own car and another car. There were 2 vehicles in the parking lot now. My Honda Accord, the one I had driven from Roanoke, sitting exactly where I had parked it. And next to it, in the space where the station wagon had been, was another Honda Accord. Same make, same model, same color, same license plate, clearly visible in the fluorescent light. But wrong, older, rusted in places where my car had no rust, weathered in ways that suggested decades rather than the 3 years I had owned my vehicle. The paint was faded, the chrome trim oxidized, the tires flat from years of sitting. It looked like my car would look if I left it in a field for 30 years, if time had its way with it, if entropy claimed everything that regular maintenance was supposed to prevent. I stood between the 2 cars, my car and its impossible twin, trying to understand what I was seeing. My keys were in my pocket. My car, my real car, the one I had been driving, was right there, exactly as I had left it, showing no signs of the aging that had claimed its counterpart. But the license plate on the older vehicle was mine. The scratches on the bumper, the small dent in the rear fender, the particular arrangement of items visible through the windows, all of it was identical to my car, or had been identical once before time had transformed it into this rusted shell. The lights in the rest stop flickered. I watched them dim and brighten, in a rhythm that felt intentional, that felt like warning. The fluorescent panels were doing something they shouldn't have been doing, moving through a pattern that no electrical fault would create, as if something was using the lights to communicate in a language I didn't speak but instinctively understood. I ran. I sprinted to my car, my real car, the one that wasn't rusted, the one that still looked like something that would start and run and carry me away from this place, and threw myself into the driver's seat. The keys were in my hand, though I didn't remember taking them from my pocket. The engine started immediately, turning over with the reliable hum that I had paid good money to maintain. I threw the car into reverse, backed out of the parking space, and accelerated down the access drive toward the parkway without looking back. I didn't check my mirrors, didn't turn my head to see if the rest stop was still there, if the other car was still sitting in its parking space, if the lights were still flickering their incomprehensible warning. I just drove, pushing my car to speeds that were dangerous on a road this dark and winding, needing to put distance between myself and whatever I had just experienced. The sun was rising by the time I reached Asheville. I had driven the remaining hours in a trance, exhaustion somehow replaced by adrenaline, my body refusing to shut down until I was somewhere that felt safe. I pulled into my apartment complex, parked in my usual spot, and sat there for a long time, watching the morning light spread across the mountains and trying to convince myself that what had happened at the rest stop was a dream, a hallucination, a product of fatigue so severe that my brain had started generating experiences that had nothing to do with reality. I've driven that stretch of parkway a dozen times since that night, in daylight and darkness, in good weather and bad, searching for the rest stop that I found when I needed it most. It isn't there. There's no building at mile marker 235, no parking lot, no access drive leading off the road into the forest. The parkway runs straight through that section, nothing but trees on both sides, nothing to suggest that a rest stop ever existed or ever could exist in that location. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced in that bathroom, the mirrors that showed delayed reflections, the faucets that ran water too cold to have come from any ordinary source, the stall doors that swung without wind or touch. I know what I found in that parking lot, my car and its impossible twin, identical in every way except for the decades of aging that separated them. And I know that sometimes, when I'm very tired, when I've been driving too long, and my eyes are starting to close despite my best efforts, I can see the rest stop ahead of me, just beyond my headlights, just out of clear focus. A building that shouldn't exist, lit by fluorescent lights that buzz with the frequency of neglect, waiting for me to pull in and park beside the station wagon and walk into the bathroom where my reflection moves a beat too slow. I haven't stopped there again. Haven't let myself get tired enough that stopping seems like a good idea. I take breaks now, at rest stops that are on the maps, at visitor centers that other people can verify, at places that exist in the same reality everyone else occupies. But the rest stop is still out there. I'm certain of it, waiting on a stretch of parkway that doesn't show it, appearing only when the conditions are right, only when someone is tired enough to need it badly enough to see it. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed longer, if I had walked into the other car instead of my own, if I had been too tired to notice the wrongness, too exhausted to run when the lights started flickering. I don't know what the rest stop wanted or what it would have taken if I had given it the chance. But I know what I saw in that parking lot. Two cars that were the same car separated by decades of time. A vehicle that could have been mine if I had never left, if I had stayed in that rest stop until years passed and rust claimed everything and the person who had been driving became something else entirely. Some rest stops aren't for resting. Some stops are one way, even if you don't realize it until you've already parked, already walked into the bathroom, already looked into a mirror that shows you exactly what you are just a moment too late. I was lucky. I got out. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the station wagon, about who was driving it, about why they stopped, about what happened to them in that rest stop that doesn't exist on any map. And I wonder if somewhere, in a parking lot that only appears when you need it most, there's a rusted station wagon sitting next to a rusted Honda Accord, both of them waiting for their drivers to come back and finish the journey they started. I hope I never find out. I hope I'm never tired enough to stop again. I left Asheville alone. I'm certain of that, as certain as I've ever been of anything in my life. The conference had ended around 9, one of those professional development seminars that my company required every year, and I had stayed an extra hour talking with colleagues I rarely saw outside of these mandatory gatherings. By the time I walked to my car in the parking garage, it was past 10, and the drive home to Boone stretched ahead of me like a sentence I was already tired of serving. I checked my back seat before getting in. This is something my mother taught me when I was 16, back when I was learning to drive, and she was terrified that every parking lot hid dangers I was too young to recognize. Always look, she would say. Always make sure you're alone before you close that door. I had followed this advice for nearly 20 years, had made it such an ingrained habit that I barely thought about it anymore, but I still did it every single time. The back seat was empty except for the jacket I had thrown there that morning, a light windbreaker I had brought in case the conference room was cold. I got in, started the car, pulled out of the garage and navigated through Asheville's downtown streets, until I reached the entrance to the Blue Ridge Parkway. I could have taken the interstate, it would have been faster, especially at this hour, but I had always loved the parkway at night, the way the darkness made the curves feel more intimate, the way the stars seemed closer when there were no city lights to compete with them. The first hour was uneventful. I drove with my windows cracked despite the October chill, letting the mountain air keep me alert, listening to a podcast about history that I was only half paying attention to. The parkway was empty, the way it usually was on weeknights, and I passed no other cars in either direction for miles at a stretch. I became aware that I wasn't alone somewhere between the French Broad overlook and the tunnel at Craggy Gardens. I can't tell you the exact moment it happened, can't point to a specific mile marker or curve where the change occurred. It was more of a gradual realization, a slow dawning awareness that something had shifted in the atmosphere of my car. The air felt different, heavy air. The silence that had seemed peaceful a few minutes before now felt like something else entirely, like the held breath of someone waiting to be discovered. I looked in my rearview mirror. There was someone in my back seat. He was sitting directly behind me, positioned so that if I turned around, I would be face to face with whatever was there. I couldn't see his features. Clearly, the shadows in my car were too deep, too dark, as if they were gathering around him intentionally, obscuring details I wasn't meant to see. But I could make out the shape of shoulders, the suggestion of a head, the outline of a figure that had not been there when I checked before getting in. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My foot moved toward the brake, then stopped, held in place by an instinct I couldn't explain. I didn't pull over, didn't stop the car, didn't turn around to confront whatever was sitting behind me. I just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror that showed me a shape I couldn't quite focus on. The dome light should have been on. My car was set to illuminate the interior whenever the doors were unlocked, and I hadn't changed that setting. But the light wasn't on. The back seat was dark in a way that defied the electronics I had paid for, in a way that suggested the darkness was intentional, chosen, a deliberate obscuring of something that didn't want to be seen. I could hear breathing. It was soft, barely audible over the hum of my engine and the rush of wind through my cracked windows. But it was there, a rhythm that wasn't my own, a cadence that suggested lungs filling and emptying in a pattern I couldn't match to anything I knew. I held my own breath, trying to isolate the sound, trying to confirm that I wasn't imagining it. The breathing continued, slow, patient, as if whatever was in my back seat had all the time in the world. I didn't acknowledge him. That was the decision I made in those first terrible moments, a choice born from some instinct I didn't understand but which felt absolutely essential. If I didn't look at him directly, if I didn't speak to him or turn around or do anything that might confirm his presence, maybe he would disappear. Maybe he was a hallucination, a product of fatigue and the late hour and the darkness that pressed close on both sides of the parkway. Maybe if I just kept driving, kept my eyes forward, kept my mouth shut, I would eventually reach a place where he no longer existed. The miles passed. The curves came and went, familiar shapes in my headlights that I navigated with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I pushed my speed higher than I should have, taking turns at 40 when 30 would have been safer, trying to reach the end of the parkway as quickly as possible. He remained. Every time I glanced in my mirror, the shape was there. Same position, same posture, same impossible shadows, gathering around a face I couldn't see. He didn't move, didn't shift, didn't do anything that might suggest he was affected by the curves I was taking or the speed I was pushing. He just sat there, patient as stone, watching me in a mirror that showed me watching him. The tunnel at Craggy Gardens swallowed my car around 2 in the morning. The darkness inside was absolute for a few moments, my headlights cutting a cone of illumination through the black, and I found myself hoping irrationally, desperately, that when I emerged on the other side, the back seat would be empty, that the tunnel would somehow reset reality, would erase whatever had materialized in my car, would give me back the solitude I had started the night with. I emerged from the tunnel, looked in my mirror. He was still there. Something in me broke then. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a cry, or any of the outward signs of terror that movies teach us to expect. Just a quiet internal collapse, an acceptance that whatever was happening was beyond my control, that I was sharing my car with something I couldn't explain and couldn't escape and couldn't even look at directly. He spoke around 3 in the morning. A single word, spoken in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. Dry, cracked. carrying an accent I couldn't place, inflections that suggested a language or a region I had never heard before, something older than these mountains, older than the road I was driving on, older than anything I had ever encountered. The word sounded like a name, something with hard consonants and soft vowels, something that might have been a person or a place or a thing I had no context for. I didn't recognize it, didn't understand what it meant or why it was being spoken to me. I didn't respond, didn't ask what he wanted or who he was or why he had appeared in my car on a stretch of parkway where I had been completely alone. I just gripped the wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator harder and tried to pretend that the voice hadn't come from directly behind my head, so close I could feel the words as much as hear them. The breathing continued. The shape remained in my mirror. The miles passed with agonizing slowness, each curve and straightaway feeling like it took hours to traverse. I started to wonder if I was dying, if this was what happened when your brain started to shut down, when oxygen deprivation or stroke or some other catastrophic failure created hallucinations so vivid they seemed more real than reality. I checked my body for symptoms, searching for pain or numbness, or any of the warning signs I had been taught to recognize. Found nothing. I was healthy, alert, completely functional in every way except for the passenger I couldn't explain and couldn't acknowledge and couldn't stop seeing in my rearview mirror. The parkway ended around 4:30. The road opened onto the highway, connecting to the broader network of routes that would carry me north toward Boone, and I felt something like hope for the first time since I had noticed the shape behind me. City lights appeared on the horizon, distant but visible, the warm glow of civilization after hours of mountain darkness. I looked in my mirror one final time. The back seat was empty. I didn't brake, didn't pull over, didn't do anything except keep driving, pushing my car toward those lights with a desperation that bordered on panic. The shape was gone. The shadows had lifted. The back seat looked exactly as it had when I checked it in the parking garage, exactly as it should have looked all along, empty except for my jacket, neatly folded on the seat where I had thrown it that morning. I reached Boone as the sun was rising, pulled into my apartment complex, parked in my usual spot, and sat there for a long time, just breathing, just trying to process what had happened over the past 6 hours. I told myself it was fatigue, told myself I had fallen asleep at some point, had dreamed the whole thing without realizing I was dreaming, told myself anything except the truth that some part of me already knew. Eventually, I got out of the car, walked to the back door, opened it, reached for my jacket. There was soil on the seat, a handful of it, sitting in a small pile on the fabric where the jacket should have been, rich and dark and slightly damp, the kind of soil you might find in a garden or a forest floor or somewhere underground where the sun never reached. It had a smell, too, not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive, carrying notes of decay and organic matter, and something else I couldn't identify. The smell of graves. I know what that smell is, because my grandmother was buried when I was 12, and I remember standing at the edge of the hole they had dug for her, looking down at the earth that would cover her casket, breathing in a scent I would never forget. The soil on my back seat smelled exactly the same. Exactly. I picked up my jacket, shook the soil out onto the pavement, looked at the empty seat, at the fabric that showed a clear impression where someone had been sitting, where weight had pressed down for hours, while I drove through mountains that suddenly felt more dangerous than they ever had before. I've never told anyone this story, never mentioned the passenger, never described the breathing or the shadows, or the single word spoken in a voice that carried accents from somewhere I've never been. I've kept it to myself for 3 years now, turning it over in my mind on sleepless nights, trying to find an explanation that doesn't require me to believe in things I was raised to dismiss. But I've started noticing things, small things, at first. A sense of being watched when I'm alone in my apartment, shadows that seem to move at the edge of my vision, that disappear when I look at them directly. A feeling, sometimes, when I'm driving at night, that the back seat isn't as empty as it should be. I check. Every time, I check. Pull over if I have to, open the back door, verify with my own eyes that there's nothing there, and there never is. Just empty seats and the jacket I still keep in my car, the same jacket I was wearing the night I picked up a passenger I don't remember stopping for. But the soil keeps appearing. Small amounts, always in the same spot on my back seat, always with that same smell of decay and earth and the places where the dead are buried. I clean it up, it comes back. I vacuum it out, it returns. I've bought new floor mats, new seat covers, done everything I can think of to break whatever connection exists between my car and the grave dirt that keeps materializing there. Nothing works. I think about the word he spoke sometimes, the name, or whatever it was, delivered in that dry, unused voice. I've searched for it online, looked for references in books about Appalachian folklore, asked people who study old languages if they recognize the sounds I can still hear in my memory. No one knows what it means. No one has ever heard anything like it, but I have a theory. I think it was my name, not the name my parents gave me, not the name on my driver's license or my apartment lease. Something older. Something that was mine before I was born. Something that will be mine after I die. Something that connects me to whatever waited in my back seat and watched me through shadows that shouldn't have existed. I think he was telling me who I am. And I think someday, when the conditions are right, when I'm driving alone on a road dark enough and empty enough, he's going to come back and explain what that name means. I don't know if I want to understand. I don't know if I have a choice. But every time I get in my car now, every time I check my back seat and find it empty, every time I smell the faint trace of grave dirt that never quite goes away no matter how much I clean, I wonder. I wonder how long until he appears again. I wonder what he'll say to me this time. And I wonder if, when he finally speaks my real name, I'll recognize it as something I've always known. Something I've just forgotten how to hear.